Yeah, great. And now we're recording. Easy. So we should be ready to go. I'll just zoom this in. Oh, nope, too much. All right.
The fine art of getting the video.
I know. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Welcome to our second panel event featuring Ally, our amazing hiring expert and recruiting specialist. So I'm going to read the bio just in case you've all missed it, because it's quite incredible to see what Ally's been up to. As you're probably aware, Ally has spent the past decade focused on perfecting the art of hiring while recruiting for renowned companies, both on agency and corporate side. So she's well experienced in the field of recruiting, and she has found a void in the market and started Ally Hires, a platform for education and training resources for HR talent acquisition professionals. And it's her mission to put the humanity back into hiring. Yes, we need this. Thank you. When not teaching others how to craft high-performing teams, she's eating sushi, watching The Office, and cuddling her 3 affectionate cats. Yes, a woman who understands the loveliness of pets. Amazing.
Hopefully they don't make an appearance tonight, but you never know.
Not a problem. So I'll just do some quick housekeeping before we get into it. So for those who haven't been to the last few panel events, I just like to start off by letting anyone know if we're discussing something that may be triggering or prompt some discomfort in relation to the toxic workplace that you either have previously experienced or are currently experiencing, please just let us know in the comments. We have a trauma therapist on hand in case you have any things that you'd like to resolve, and she does offer a 15-minute debrief consultation, so please know that you're not alone. You are in safe hands, and there is someone here who genuinely wants to look after you. Along with that as well, on the website under the perks section, we have a list of hotlines and resources that you can tap into in case you are feeling especially triggered by some of the events that may be occurring. So don't worry at all, we completely understand and we are here to help. So with that said, I also thought it's worth mentioning that each of these panels run for about 50 minutes, and then in the last 10 minutes we have a Q&A. So if you have any questions, if things pop up while we're having the chat, just you can start adding them into the chat box and we'll select them at the end and go through them. And also, for every question that you ask, you go into the running to win some of several prizes. So one of them is a handful of self-help books or toxic workplace or workplace culture books. And the other is a 60-minute consultation package. So you can read all about that in perks as well. And if you share it with a friend or share this panel event with a friend, you also go into the running to, you increase your chances of winning. So that's a small little update. But let's get into the main panel event with Ally. Let me just draw this up. So I usually like to start off this conversation with a little bit about a background in toxic workplace culture, because I think most of us have been there. We know what it's like, and unfortunately it's all too common. So what has your experience been with toxic workplace culture?
Absolutely. I come from a meal-driven industry, so I specialize in hospitality and restaurants. I've been in that space for the last 15 years, hiring in it for the last decade, but it's very much a meal-driven. And we've seen this, in the last year or two after post-Me Too movement, starting with Weinstein, it's trickled down into other industries. And I remember at the time when I saw that, I was like, oh, we're definitely going to see this in the restaurant industry. So I think there's been that, but even beyond that, to give a specific example, well, first, I always tell people you learn as much from your good bosses as you do your bad ones, because I do feel like even in toxic work environments, there's takeaways. So specifically, I've had an amazing relationship with a supervisor that soured quickly as soon as I put in notice. And our working history had been wonderful leading up to that. I gave a professional notice with, beyond the 2 weeks, and it just went sour and toxic really fast. So unfortunately, I've definitely witnessed it.
Yeah, Yeah, I think, and that's unfortunately it's become so normalized that it's not even a have you, it's more of it's assumed you have, and it's more about how we deal with that and this kind of normalization. So with that said, what then drove you to like how does recruiting play into this whole element of shaping workplace culture, and how did you get into this recruitment space?
So to answer the first part, I think who you hire is everything. So the people that form your teams are going to dictate the environment that you have. I've seen amazing companies be soured by one bad apple, who creates that toxic work environment. So I personally, and I think all recruiters do, we take it upon ourselves, that onus of responsibility to make sure that we're hiring people that are going to contribute to a cohesive, holistic experience for a team, because really a team is, an amalgam of different personalities coming together, and you have to think about that when you're hiring. You want to make sure you have personalities that are going to complement one another, both technically as well as with those soft skills. So if you have a leader who's a little more abrasive, then maybe when that position opens up for that number two, you want someone that has maybe more characteristics that are more approachable. So that way you're balanced out in that approach within your leadership. But I just feel like with recruiting, who you hire, it really is what dictates the workplace culture. And then your second question, how I got into recruiting. So I always get around that. So I used to, I started out serving, worked my way through college bartending, found myself managing restaurants after college. And I love being in restaurants, but I realized I'd never want to spend another end of a night at 3 a.m. in a walk-in freezer crying just because of the stress and the pressure and guests and just everything. And my favorite parts of my job were wine as well as interviewing people. And wine jobs are very hard to come by. There were at the time maybe 8 sommelier positions in all of Los Angeles, which is where I'm based. And interviewing, I really loved it, and I was able to get a position at a well-known agency, and that was 9.5 years ago. So I haven't looked back since. I think I knew, probably within the first 6 to 8 weeks that this was it for me the rest of my life. I had found my calling in life when it comes to hiring and interviewing.
Amazing. And I think that's sort of the battle, finding something that we love and then also getting paid for it and everything else. So it's good to hear that you've sort of found that sweet spot and you're helping improve lives, or at least that's the aim. Yeah. The next thing I wanted to cover was yes. So in regards to positive workplace culture, I think recruiters are this really interesting point because you get inside knowledge on, you get fed inside knowledge on how the company, what's going on behind the scenes of the company and what they're looking for specifically for this next role and where they're kind of progressing. So you sort of have this really intimate relationship with the company in that sense. So I would love to know how you can identify positive workplace culture as a recruiter and then share this information with someone who's looking for a new position. How does this kind of dynamic work?
Absolutely. So I think you hit it like the nail on the head. So I think recruiters, we tend to have a bird's eye view of just what's going on in the company across the board. Sometimes when you're in the interview with, say, a hiring manager specifically, they sometimes have that tunnel vision because they're looking strictly at their department, what they need in the here and the now. And usually recruiters are privy to a little bit more bigger picture knowledge as well. So they might know a little bit more about the strategy of the company, or, one of the beauties is if you work in-house like I do, and I've worked for agencies in the past and I work on the corporate side now, I'm involved in so many different departments with hiring that I really can see what's going on across the board. So when it comes to having conversations with candidates, being able to give them insight not only into what this role looks like, but how a company functions as a whole. And then on the flip side of that coin, for people that are finding themselves in interviews, one of the best things you can do, ask a recruiter, ask the person in that first initial interview, how they would describe the company as a whole, where the path of the company is going. So, recruiters, I call it lazy recruiting, they fall back on that question, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Which I hate. But I think as, an interviewee, I think you should be asking them, where do you see this company going in 5 years?
Mm-hmm. And that's so important as well, to start the two-way conversation early on, and know that just because you are looking for a job, it doesn't mean that the person who's hiring you is in this position of power where they can kind of pick and choose. It's sort of like they are also privileged to be having your talents and skills onto the workplace, and it needs to be more of that mutual playing field, rather than seeming as though they're doing you a favor by giving you a job when, you know,
Absolutely.
it's your time.
Oh my gosh, 100%. I always call it conversations or meetings or discussions. Like, I actually don't even like to use the word interview. I do, because that's, you know, in a space and in a, you know, platform like this, that's what everyone knows it is. But when I talk to candidates or I'm scheduling somebody, I'm actually saying to them, great, I look forward to meeting you. Or do you have time, you know, chat on the phone on this day? Like, I feel like the moment you remove that word interview, it levels the playing field, and it just takes away that instant anxiety I think most people have.
Mm-hmm. So I guess in relation to that as well, unfortunately at the moment, I think we're all aware of the horrifying statistics around unemployment. I think in America, the last time I checked, it was something like 9%. I think it's probably jumped up to like 13%, if not higher. There's a lot of mixed information about what the actual numbers are for unemployment at the moment. And I know in Australia, we're facing a really similar issue. Where do you see the future of recruitment heading, given this impending recession and the current state of things with the coronavirus?
Absolutely. You know, so leading up to this, we've had historically low unemployment rates. And what that meant is that recruiters had to go above and beyond to find candidates. Many times you had very low applicant pools. So maybe you post a job and you have 5 people apply, where 5 years ago you would have had 20, and a decade ago in the last recession, you might have had 100 people applying. And we're going to see ourselves going back there. So I feel that it's most important thing is for recruiters not to lose sight of that humanity aspect, you know, of this is still an individual. And even if you are completely inundated with 200 applications, because there's so many more people in the market, you know, making sure that every person gets a response, even if it's not a personal like phone call, you know, even an email letting them know that they're not moving forward. You know, so many times people say, you know, you apply to a job and it just goes down that black hole and you don't hear back at all. So I feel it's incredibly important for recruiters to keep sight, and not just recruiters, hiring managers, companies in general, that even though the market pendulum is swinging towards unemployment being high and having more candidates available, you still need to have that personalized touch.
And I think that that's kind of what comes, one of the key differences between recruiters who treat this as a sales transition and the ones who very much look at this as a human interaction and a connection that could further this person's career and lifestyle and well-being, rather than just I filled in the slot, on to the next one. So it's good to hear that there are some
100%.
recruiters.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think when you work with recruiters, you can tell which ones are invested in what they do and in their industry. Particularly, like for myself, I've always been in the hospitality space, and what that means is there's some people that I've hired 3 times in the last 9 years, you know, or they've sent me people they know, they've sent me relatives, they've sent me friends, you know, even once I've moved on companies, you know, they're still referring me people, even though I don't work at an agency anymore. They're like, oh, just talk to Ally. She'll know, she'll be able to at least give you good advice and pointers. And I feel like if you're able to make those connections with somebody in the hiring space, it goes far both ways, you know, long term.
Yeah. And it is more about that long-term relationship and connection rather than a one-off, one and done kind of deal. So that's really good to hear. And I guess also there's been a lot of emphasis on remote work at the moment, especially given everything that's going on with COVID-19. And I think companies are just starting to adjust to this idea that remote work could be the new norm. So with that said, I think a lot of people are transitioning to see themselves as more digitally native and consider how they can be putting their profile and branding in a way that is very much like tech savvy. So with that said, how do you see people leveraging their networks and their digital networks to future-proof their career?
LinkedIn, 100%. Like LinkedIn is the professional website for finding jobs. You know, I know certain industries also sometimes have very specific ones. And I definitely, you know, encourage if there's one that's hyper focused, layers are focused into your niche, whether that's, let's say you're a front stack developer in IT, you know, or something along those lines. I know sometimes there's particular groups for those, but across the board, LinkedIn is the best area you can invest your time in, to leverage those digital networks. Because I mean, really, there are people I haven't talked to in probably a decade, but we're connected on LinkedIn. Or I've had somebody, not more than once, I've had somebody in an interview tell me, oh, we've been connected for like 4 years. It's so nice to finally meet you in an interview. So it's amazing how those connections work out sometimes.
I think that, I mean, one of the things that is for recruiters, I mean, you would get inundated with requests and comments and all kinds of things. So I guess on your side, it's sort of a matter of, you know, maintaining that relationship, but then also filtering the ones that are specifically relevant. Do you kind of have a tendency to, like, how would you manage that LinkedIn relationship without necessarily ignoring or ghosting the people who aren't immediately relevant to the field that you're looking into?
Oh my gosh. So this is one of those things that keeps me up at night. You know, like these are the things that like at 11 p.m. I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't return their phone call. So you know, I'd say, you know, give people grace. I think sometimes candidates don't realize that a recruiter might be talking to, you know, several people at once, because many times we're working on more than one position, whether you're at an agency or you're in-house for a company. You usually have anywhere from 12 to 25 positions on your plate. So, you know, if you have at least 3 candidates for each of those, it multiplies very quickly. What I like to do and what helps me make sure that nobody falls through the cracks is I basically put time in my calendar so that, you know, LinkedIn, I check twice a week. I go through my messages and I clear it out completely. That means if somebody writes to me Thursday night, they might not hear from me till Tuesday, because I usually do it Tuesday, Thursday. But I find by having clear dictated times for myself on my schedule, like if it's in your calendar, you're going to do it. And I make sure I go through all of them. So that way it's cleared out completely. So there's nobody lingering. But I would say give people grace. I think, you know, people expecting responses within 24 hours. You know, one of the biggest things advice wise I give job seekers is, you know, you absolutely follow up on an application after 3 to 4 days, but not 5 times in the first 24 hours. Or, you know, I get sometimes when people apply and they immediately reach out, you know, they'll message me on LinkedIn, they'll find my work number, they'll email me all within an hour of applying. And for me, I would reject that person based on poor judgment skills, you know, because that shows a lack of judgment. You know, and of course it correlates to the job they're applying for. But I highly recommend definitely follow up, but wait 3 to 4 days.
Mm-hmm. And there is that kind of sweet spot as well. So thank you for giving the specific numbers around it, because I feel like sometimes it can be this like you're only in the know and it's not openly available knowledge for everyone. So it's really handy that you can share that. Thank you.
Absolutely.
I just noticed that my video might blink out, so I'm going to fix that. Give me a second. But I will leave you with this question in case something happens. So yeah, as we enter a time of increasing instability and layoffs and like hiring freezes and everything else, I think it is really tricky, because obviously someone who is experiencing a toxic workplace culture, or even someone who's just dissatisfied with their current workplace, we're no longer looking at it as, oh, I can just quit and leave because of all this instability and insecurity around the workforce at the moment. So what would your advice be for someone who's kind of like sitting idle, they're stuck in a position that they don't want to be in, but it's just not the right time to be moving? How can they be using this time to essentially future-proof their career?
Absolutely. So I'm going to say it's 3 things. They're really like, there's kind of a trifecta to it. First of all, take advantage of this time to focus on training and upskilling. If you know that, hey, I'm not that good with Excel and that's a key part of my job, like take the time to take extra classes online. There's so many free resources out there. You know, if you need more marketing or whatever that area is, maybe you're not as good at social media, you know, take a course. You know, there's so many, just the amount of training that exists on the internet. It's a beautiful thing. Like it really is. Like you can learn about anything. And I know firsthand, I knew nothing about social media about a year ago and taught myself everything from scratch. And when I look at how far that's come, so I'd say focus on training, because that gives you also tangible things that you can add to your resume, which is my second thing. Go ahead and start now on brushing up that resume. I find that, I think the biggest thing that holds people back is they feel like they don't know where to start. They don't know how to make their resume stand out. So this is the time, utilize it to look up articles and read information, look at templates for resumes. I personally highly recommend include accomplishments. I know it's almost a cliche to say that, but the more numbers you can put on your resume, the more numbers actually pop out when people are reading. And there's studies that show that your eye naturally gravitates towards them. So if you can show that you've reduced cost or whatnot, and during this time, when maybe you're not out interviewing and you're not quite applying for jobs, this is the time you can actually put together those numbers, especially if you work in a small company where maybe their metrics or their tracking isn't quite as good. It's going to take you a bit longer. And I know I've been there, to be able to compile those numbers that you want to have to show on your resume. So second thing would be the resume. And then the third thing, to loop back, LinkedIn. So this is also the time to flesh out your profile, look at other profiles and maybe industry leaders or people with comparable jobs to what you do, whose profiles you really like, that speak to you, that you're like, wow, they look like they're amazing at XYZ. If it speaks to you, that's what your profile should, obviously don't copy it, but, you can draw on it for inspiration. I highly recommend your LinkedIn should be fully fleshed out. And also, secret tip, your tagline. I know a lot of people love to put something super creative like marketing guru. Use the actual title of the job you want next. So if you're looking for marketing director opportunities, you can put, marketing director and social media expert, having those keywords in there. That way, when recruiters are looking for you on LinkedIn, you'll actually pop up, because none of us are looking for a marketing guru. We're looking for a marketing manager, a marketing director. So even though it seems like it's more average and normal, it works out much better in your favor if you use a title that's commonly known.
Yeah, at the moment, so my background's in marketing, and growth hacker is like this big buzzword, and it essentially just means that, yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with it. So I've been seeing that everywhere at the moment, and I'm like, I wonder if that's really, is that a job title, or is that just something that people want to align themselves with? But
business disruptor. What does that even mean? Like, I've seen people in multiple niches call themselves a business disruptor, but you don't know what that actually means. So absolutely.
No, that's really handy. Thank you. So I guess, and this kind of ties really nicely into the next question, which is, what is your advice to someone who has left a toxic work environment with an unreliable reference, or without that kind of security of knowing that the person who will be called upon is someone they can rely on for, a glowing review? I think this is something that, we've all had to deal with in some form, and it can be really hard to kind of skirt around that issue if we've really had to just dust a place off and start fresh. So
absolutely. No, and that's that's such a tough place to be in. It really is. One thing I like to tell people is, don't let that hold you back from moving forward in your career, because honestly, a lot of companies that are moving forward positively are actually starting to do away with reference checking. So they might do job verification, where they just check, did you work from this date to this date? And they only want to talk to HR or call a hotline, because they don't want to hear, colored views and things along those lines. So the nice thing is, a lot more companies are becoming progressive with not actually doing, checking references versus verifying you worked where you said you worked, with the titles and the dates that you said. That said, if you haven't left the job yet and you think you might have some possible references, but they might be unreliable, like you're not sure if, hey, once I actually put in my notice, are they still going to give me that great reference? I would take advantage and, say that you're updating your LinkedIn, that you'd love if they can give you a recommendation on LinkedIn, because that's something that will permanently live there. And so that you always have that, it's almost like a letter of reference, right? Not many people do that anymore, but it's kind of the same thing by having those recommendations on LinkedIn. And that you can do under the guise of, hey, I'm updating my LinkedIn. We should all do that for our company. It gives us a more professional appearance. Do you mind writing me a recommendation? And securing that recommendation before you put in your notice, and maybe that relationship sours. And then if you've already left your job and you're worried about that, my first piece of advice is, it doesn't have to be the person you reported to. Ideally, in an ideal world, yes, everyone loved the supervisor's recommendation, but if you still at least have contact information, maybe a coworker that you had a positive working relationship with that can speak to your experience, ideally somebody within the same department, you can utilize that person as a reference as well. My last piece of advice for this is do not bring up the references in an interview unless they bring it up. So what I see sometimes is that people will self-sabotage in an interview where, when I'm talking to them and they're, oh, did I lose you?
Oh, so this is why I have screens. I'm still here. It's okay. My video is gone, but let's just keep going.
Okay, perfect. So as I say, my last piece of advice is don't self-sabotage in an interview. You don't need to give all the personal gritty details of where things went wrong and how things became toxic. You're able to say, for example, you were part of a layoff, and there were 4 other people laid off in your department or across the different teams, but you felt like you were targeted because it was a toxic work environment. You don't actually need to share that in an interview. You can let them know, unfortunately, you were laid off along with 4 other people. I would avoid bringing up the references, but the moment, you start to bring it up, then of course somebody's going to naturally ask for them. So I would not bring up references unless the recruiter or the hiring manager asks for them.
I love that as well, because I feel like it's such an automatic response to go, oh, and I've got my references up and ready. And it's almost like, especially if you know that your references aren't great, you might almost try overcompensating for that by saying you got them on hand. And that could even be, an indicator that something isn't quite right as well, especially for a trained recruiter who kind of knows how to identify these signals. So it's really handy to know that, we don't have to like jump to the gun and rush into it because you'll kind of had that conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah. Let them be the one to bring that up first. Yeah. 100%.
So in relation to that as well, I wanted to touch base on the fact that obviously you're based in America, and it's really cool that we have, speakers from all over the world and listeners from all over the world. And I think that that's one of the great things about, discussing culture, because there are so many different elements that could come into play. So I would love to know, based on your experience in America, have you seen any cultural shifts around workplace culture and the conversations that are currently happening in America? I know, for example, in Australia, we kind of have this almost like an archaic tall poppy syndrome where no one really wants to speak out or stand out. It's all kind of like, we're known to be chill and kind of like laid back, and we say things like, she'll be right, and which essentially just means like, don't worry about it, things will work themselves out. And I think that this is not always conducive of change, and it can sometimes hold us back. So in that sense, I'm always sort of aware about that, how that culture may be implementing our workplace, and maybe that could be a factor as to why some people don't feel like they should speak up, because it's just so ingrained in like our society. So yeah, I would love to know a bit about how this works in America. Like, do you have something similar about workplace culture, and what's your take on this?
I hear you there. So with Americans, I think it's kind of a well-known fact, we don't take vacation time. We don't get a lot of vacation time to begin with. I'm not sure if it's different in Australia. I talked to my European friends and they're just like, oh yeah, 6 weeks here, 8 weeks here. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, how is that possible? I'd say 10 years ago, just in the last 10 years, I feel like people are so much more empowered to have a better work-life balance, and whatever that might mean for you. So that can mean, I've seen various scenarios, working from home 1 or 2 days a week, or flexible working hours because of daycare or childcare needs, or, taking that vacation time. Because again, I think 10 years ago, even when I started out in recruiting, it was a lot harder to take that time off and fully disconnect. And that's something I personally still struggle with. But that's a personal work ethic thing, versus I think and also it's just an overall, I think American trait is we feel very bound to our jobs, and it's hard to disconnect. And seeing leadership in large prominent companies starting to come forward and say, you need to take this time off. It's mandatory you take some of this vacation time. I don't like to speak specifically about where I work currently, but I will give one example. halfway through the year, they sent out letters to anyone who hadn't taken any vacation time yet. And that to me was astonishing, like, and in the most amazing ways, that they're like, hey, you haven't taken any vacation time, you should take a day off. That's amazing. Like, it wasn't coming from just like your department head. This was coming from the very top, I mean, for that to be such a part of the, HR system, that's amazing to me. So I personally appreciate that. As Americans, I think we're starting to come along when it comes to that work-life balance.
Mm. And actually, there's recent statistics saying that we actually, in Australia, we don't take enough time off. We don't take all of our allocated time off. And I think that often comes down to the financial pressures and also the subtle pressures of the workplace that say, you can take time off, but just know when you get back, you'll have like double the amount of work to do. And so people might be going, maybe it's not worth me taking that time off right now because it'll just end up being a complete overload. So yeah, it's interesting.
Or, you can take that vacation, but you don't mind taking your laptop with you, right? Like, you don't have to check your email maybe like twice a day, but just in case we need you to do something, believe me, I've been there. I've had to take a work laptop with me internationally. So I've definitely been there.
Let me just see. I think this is up and running again. Yeah, here. So I've just switched to the other screen. Sorry, this one isn't as, it has this wonderful greenish look, but it's fine. It's better than nothing. So yeah, I was just going to, along with that as well, I wanted to mention that, I mean, obviously at the moment, there's a lot about everything being automated and AI sort of taking over a lot of job roles. And I think there is this fear and insecurity around what the future of jobs will hold. So, I mean, and I know, especially with recruiting, you guys do have, I've forgotten what it's called, maybe it's different in every country, but essentially like a filtering system. So when a resume comes through, it automatically looks for those keywords. And if you don't fit that criteria, you don't even reach human eyes. It just goes straight into this bin, and that person doesn't stand a chance. And I think that I can see why that might be more efficient from a business perspective. But it's really terrifying to know that if someone doesn't have the technical skills, or they don't know what those keywords are, they don't even stand a chance of like showing their personality or showing other elements of their skill set, because they're automatically just ruled out. And then of course, when we look at it from an ethical perspective as well, there are so many people who don't even have access to that kind of technology and can't necessarily upskill as easily. So it automatically pulls it to a very, very small number of people who are privileged, have access to all this information, and know exactly what those keywords are. And so it just doesn't, in regards to equality and inclusivity and creating this kind of like more well-rounded work culture, before people even get the chance to make that case, they're automatically ruled out. And I think that's kind of terrifying.
I'm going to jump in. To tell you, companies don't have the capability. So I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions about recruiting, like genuinely. When I worked for an agency, I worked with over 300 clients. Not a single one of them had that technology. Unless you're working in the IT sector and you're working at, say, Amazon or Google or Facebook, one of these big IT giants, your average company is not doing anything like that. In fact, most mid-sized companies don't even have an applicant tracking system. And I think that's what you're really touching on. So an applicant tracking system is being able to apply electronically. And in that process, you'll usually put, your information, your work history, that sort of thing. But the amount of companies that are using the keyword, that's going to be something like JP Morgan, that's going to be like a large investment banking firm. I would say there's probably less than, those are like the Fortune 50s versus I worked for even companies within the Fortune 300s, and they did not use anything like that. I mean, one of the second largest hospitality company in the entire world that's very well known, their version of AI was that chat box, do you need help applying for a job today? So I don't think there's this misconception sometimes. I think when you hear the biggest companies in the world are using it, you think everybody else is, and it's honestly, it's not the fact. What you do see though, and what I do recommend is, there will be questions sometimes, so like application questions like, do you have legal working papers to work in the United States or in Australia or New Zealand? Because maybe that's a position where they don't have it in the budget to sponsor a J1 visa. So maybe if you say, no, I don't have legal working papers to work in that country, then maybe you'll be rejected because you voluntarily answer that question. Likewise, sometimes I think what you see more commonly with applicant tracking systems are those questions like, do you have 2 years marketing experience? If you have 1 year and 9 months marketing experience, say yes. You know, if you're close enough to that 2 years, I highly recommend round up. Like if you know, or sometimes we'll be like, you know, do you have, you know, let's say it's a beginner entry level role. Let's say it's for a coordinator. Do you have 1 year of HR experience? And maybe you worked in a retail job where you did the hiring and the training. And yeah, your title wasn't an HR manager because you don't even have one at your location, but you did fulfill some of those responsibilities. Say yes. You know, they want to see, do you have relevant experience? So I do find sometimes people self-elect themselves out because they're almost like too hard on themselves with the you know, those types of questions. I also know a lot of companies, at least in the United States, I can't speak internationally, you know, questions like, do you have a degree? You know, we're not supposed to, there's some government regulations, and if a company has government contracts, they can't then automatically dismiss somebody because they don't have a certain like degree, or so usually it's more seen as a plus rather than a requirement. Likewise, being bilingual. So usually being bilingual in another language, like, you know, whether that's Spanish or Chinese or whatever language that might be, it's an asset, not a requirement that will filter you out, at least in the United States, because you can't automatically dismiss somebody for those legal reasons. But I will say that the whole finding keywords in resumes is actually, it's a very expensive technology, which is why I think most companies, you know, and I think most companies do understand where you can miss out on really good people because you're leveraging technology the wrong way, if that makes sense. Versus having AI that is that text chat box that says, oh, what type of job are you looking for today? That helps you navigate through a website. That's a little bit more friendly and can help you out. I've used those AI chat boxes with things like just leaving like tech support, you know, that is what I see more commonly with AI.
Okay, that's good to know. I mean,
yeah. Rest assured, not everybody is doing that. It's actually, I feel like very rare companies can afford that technology.
All right, cool. And actually, this brings me to something else that I wanted to ask as well. As far as filtering out candidates go, I think there's a lot about, you know, should you include a profile picture? How can they really be neutral if they are looking at who you are, and you know, this can include anything from like racial discrimination to gender and everything else. So what's your take on like kind of the visual appearance side of things, and whether we should be including an image in our CV, and whether we should be you know, emphasizing that element of who we are?
So the rule of thumb is no photos on your resume or CV, photos on your LinkedIn profile. So, and I've had companies as clients before that have outright rejected people because there was a photo on their resume and they said, I can't interview that person because I don't want it portrayed in any way that they got this for XYZ reason, whether that's ethnicity or gender, you know. So I would actually go ahead and do not, you know, you don't want to get actually eliminated because you did include a photo, because HR is afraid that it will come off as discrimination or favoritism on the flip side. So, but go ahead and put one on your LinkedIn profile. I think it helps build what I like to call social proof. So, and that's what a LinkedIn profile does. It builds that social proof, especially when, hey, you know, a lot of us as recruiters will look at your resume, you know, have a great interview, jump on and check your LinkedIn. 99% of the time they match up perfectly in sync, which means great, everything aligns, you know, they're truthful. But there are times I've been doing this so long. I've interviewed over 11,000 people that in interviews, sometimes I definitely can pick up when I'm like, oh, something's a little fishy here. So, you know, I hop on the LinkedIn and then turns out I'm like, well, they didn't mention this job and that's not on their resume. So then I do a little Googling, which I never do, to be honest, the Googling side of things. But when there's red flags, and that's, knock on wood, usually I can trust my instinct that then other things will come out. So make sure your LinkedIn and your resume CV match up. But photo on the LinkedIn, no photo on the CV or resume.
Yeah, cool. And I think that just in relation to that as well, this isn't, it just popped up, but basically I think a lot of people, I mean, especially when you have such a long career, you can't include everything on your CV and you can't really include it all on your LinkedIn. So those gaps and the bits that don't necessarily make sense, hopefully a lot of recruiters will understand that, you know, there's there's an element where you're not going to be giving the entire career overview. You're just really selecting the elements that are most related to the job you're applying for. And I guess, yeah, is that kind of the way you try to approach things as well? Like if you do see a gap, you know, you can
I'd go back like 10 years.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think you need to include more than 10 years. Like, you know, we don't need to know what your first job in high school was. So those sort of things. Also, if you had any second jobs or part-time gigs, you know, that doesn't need to be included either. You can kind of omit that. You really want it to be, you know, everything you've done in the last 10 years, especially I think the most critical thing are the last 5 years. But know that if there's a gap, you know, most seasoned recruiters are going to ask you. So if there's, and by a gap, I don't mean, you know, 2 months, you know, I mean, if there's a 2-year gap, then yeah, that becomes actually like a red flag. Like, why didn't you include this? What happened here? You're better off including, if you worked anywhere for 2 years, please, it should be on your resume. But like you said, if it was a 1-month freelance, you definitely don't need to include that. You know, if you want to have a client section or a freelance section at the bottom where you just kind of list some, you don't need to put dates or bullets, that's an option. I usually say freelance should go at the bottom versus long-term employment at the top, depending on what you're applying for. So if you're applying for contract freelance roles, then obviously it would be flipped.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know what the word for that is, but apparently it's a different type of resume as well. Like whether it's hierarchical or in line with the timing or more in line with your skill set. But I've read there's a few different ways of approaching that as well. So there are ways of kind of like filling out gaps without necessarily seeming like there are gaps. So
absolutely, yeah, 100%. When I worked for an agency, we got really good at that. So chefs are known for jumping around jobs, regardless of what country they're in. So sometimes helping them with like, oh, maybe you should put your consulting at the bottom, because sometimes it looks bad when you see 6 months here, 4 months here, 3 months, but really those were a 3-month contract, you know, or a 6-month contract. And don't be afraid to put on your resume when you put, you know, at the top, when you have, you know, usually at the top you have the name of the company and then the dates, you know, you can put in parentheses contract or temporary. That way a recruiter, when they're looking automatically, they know, oh, that's why these are short durations.
Because it was just part of the original agreements, and that's kind of looked upon slightly more favorably than if you just dropped out randomly or whatever the situation may have been. So
yeah, absolutely.
That's a good tip. I also like what you mentioned before about, you know, sort of going for it anyway, even if you don't necessarily have the full like 9 months. Come on, that's close enough. I know there's like a really common fact about women only applying for like 80% of the jobs, and the number is always changing, I swear, but we know that it's something like men will go for it if they've got like, you know, 5 out of the 10 skills, whereas women will be like, we need to tick all those boxes before we try it. So I appreciate you
100%.
giving that.
I think I first read that in the book Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg.
That's the one.
Yeah, I think that's where I first read about that study, and I just remember being like, oh my goodness, she's absolutely right. I know I personally, in applying for positions, am like, well, I haven't done this, you know, or talking with friends and acquaintances, you know, it's the same thing. Like I always encourage, you know, everybody, you know, go after the positions you're looking for. Obviously, you know, if you're fresh out of college, you're not going to be an HR manager, you know, and that's actually something I have with my Instagram account. I get a lot of people that are newly graduates that are like, how do I get into recruiting? How do I get into HR? But they think they should be an HR director out the gate. And I'm like, they're like, nobody's calling me back. I can't get a single interview. And I'm like, well, what are you applying for? And I'm like, wait. So what you should be applying for is an HR coordinator or an HR, you know, admin, you know, definitely apply within your skill set. But once you establish your career, there's nothing wrong with going for the next step, you know, and going for that next level.
So realistic goal setting, essentially. But then also I think there is, I mean, I know especially with marketing, you can have like several different words for the same job description. So like an account executive sounds really fancy, but it's actually like considered to be a, you know, a bottom level role. So I think that there's a lot of misconception around like what titles people should be looking for when they are doing either a career transition or entering into a different stage of their career as well.
Something for that, actually. So I think one of the most underrated things is Google Trends. So Google Trends, you can look and let's say, I'll use recruiting. Let's say you're debating whether you should say your title was a talent acquisition manager or a recruiting manager. You can pop it in Google Trends and it will let you know which is searched more. And sometimes there are radical differences. Sometimes they're close, but more often than not, one is searched way more. And even sometimes it's fine tuning, as we've been talking about marketing, a director of marketing versus a marketing director. Which title is more commonly searched? And you'd be amazed. Like there is, I remember I was looking this up. I think I actually put a tutorial on my Instagram at one point, like with screenshots showing these differences, including that title, marketing director versus director of marketing. So look at Google Trends if you're questioning which titles you should use.
That is golden. Thank you. Very handy. Awesome. So I'm just aware that we've got 5 minutes before the questions start coming in. I would love to, let me just check. Yes. So I always like to throw in like a little devil's advocate question just to kind of see what the response could be. So I know with recruiting, and it does depend on different companies and different recruiters, but sometimes it can seem a little bit like recruiters are very much just after that sale and they just treat this as a transaction. And we did touch on this a little bit at the start of the conversation, but I think it's really important to be able to distinguish the recruiters who actually have the best intentions and those who are just very much treating this as, I can't wait to get my bonus. So in Australia, and I don't know if this is the same for America, but basically if you place someone in the position and they've stayed in it for at least 3 months, you end up getting the bonus. And I think this changes depending on the incentives and the like reward schemes for different companies, but generally that's the go-to for Australian recruiters. And the frustrating thing about this is it means that they can just be pushing people through for the sake of it rather than actually giving the right talent match and nurturing the leads that they have. So I would love to hear, how do you distinguish the difference between a shark salesy kind of recruiter and the ones who really care about the people and their career paths?
Absolutely. First, so one clarification, usually people that work for agencies, recruiters that work for an agency where they have a variety of clients, that is how they pay their bills, is they receive a commission or a bonus, most of them. I will be on, when I started out working for an agency, my first 2 years, I didn't receive a single bonus or commission, regardless of how many people we placed. It was about finding the right people for the right jobs. And we got paid a salary that was a livable wage rather than some really low base where you're trying to make your money on the commission. So I was very fortunate that my introduction to recruiting was a very different lens than some people's.
Yeah.
Also, people that work in-house, so if they work for a company, so most companies of a certain size, you're going to hear from an HR manager, a recruiter, a recruitment manager as your first point of contact when you apply. Those people are not getting bonuses or commissions, at least here in the United States. If you work in-house, it doesn't matter whether I fill a position in 12 days or if I fill it in 6 weeks. It doesn't matter if I fill 75 in a year or 50. My goal is to find best people that are going to be happy long-term working for my company. So I will clarify the differences there. So the nice thing to know is if you're applying at a company directly, chances are there's nothing along those lines are relevant. They're just really about finding that right connection and that long-term fit. But when you're working with agencies, and working with agencies can be an amazing tool. It really can, especially I feel like people that are newer in their careers where they might not know the playing field quite as well, or if you've recently relocated to a new area where, again, you don't know who the people are and who's reputable and isn't. The nice thing is most recruiters aren't going to work with clients that either don't pay their people correctly or have toxic work environments. And I can speak firsthand about that. At an agency, we definitely had to blacklist some clients because, we placed a couple people and they came back and shared their experiences, and those weren't the type of companies we were going to represent. When you look at working with recruiters, looking at their websites, looking at their social proof, some companies have gone away from websites and now they're more so on LinkedIn or they're more so on Instagram. Regardless of the platform they're on, look at their social proof. And most importantly, if they are only posting jobs, that's all they do, that's not a recruiter you want to work with. What you want to look for is somebody that's invested in the industry you work in. So whether that's IT or marketing or cosmetics, if they're posting about some event they went to last week, or, this latest news on market trends, or I'm excited about this opening, if they're genuinely passionate about that industry, that's someone who's going to be there 20 years from now that you might come back to. Maybe they place you once and 5 years later you come back, or maybe they don't place you. You find a job on your own, but then when you find yourself on the market, those are the people you want to form connections with because they're invested in the industry and the people beyond just being recruiters. People that jump industries, I find usually have less of a connection, and it usually is a little bit more about the money than a genuine just passion and love for what they do and where they work.
So that's really handy to
Great
know.
question, by the way.
Yeah, cool. I think that it's always the risk of, you know, lumping everyone into the same category, but there are so many nuances within each industry and even within the people who run or operate within that as well. So I think it's good to know that, yeah, there's always like a light side of the.
Oh yeah. And I've had, you know, people say like, oh, I don't want to talk to a recruiter. And I'm like, well, unfortunately, if you'd like to work at our company, you're going to have a conversation with me. So, you know, I'm usually just very honest with them. Like, unfortunately, that's how that works. So.
Yeah, and I think that whole, you know, don't want to talk to a recruiter is exactly that, because they want to be their own like PR representative. They want to put themselves out in a way that best represents themselves. So I think there's always that element of I don't want someone else to, you know, misrepresent me and then I lose out on an opportunity that I should have been good for.
I think that's I think that's very rare that happens. I think sometimes people not getting a job like to use that as a scapegoat when usually it's something that happened in the interview. So I find that it less usually has to do with the recruiter, because think about it, at the end of the day, the recruiter's fighting for you. They want you to get a job. If it's somebody who works in an agency, they're going to commission, or if it's somebody who is in-house, they want to find that right long-term fit. So yeah, I would say usually I feel like a little bit of a scapegoat for when somebody makes a mistake in the interview, and that's one of the unfortunate things about interviewing is you don't always know exactly why you got passed on. And for HR reasons, sometimes there's, you know, some companies limit their HR and their recruiting teams from being able to share pinpoint precise reasons, right? Like, oh, you know, it's because you gave this one answer in the interview and unfortunately somebody else gave a different interview response, you know? So unfortunately, I feel like always finding out 100% why you didn't get a position sometimes can be a little bit more nuanced.
Yeah. And it's great that you're kind of aware of that and still try and navigate around it. So just to wrap things up, I'd love to know a bit more about, you know, what you currently specialize in right now, maybe some top tips that you could give, just a quick little takeaway for the rest of us who are interested in, I imagine a lot of people would be more in the mature stage of their career and they're looking for either a career transition or ways to navigate around the current climate. So yeah, any tips that you could share would be amazing.
Absolutely. You know, I think for somebody looking to transition in their career, if you're looking at, I think one of the hardest things is transitioning industries. So transitioning completely out of what you do. So maybe it's going from a cosmetics quality assurance person to getting into marketing. And what I find sometimes is that people don't want to take that step back. And unfortunately, you know, sometimes you do need to take a small one. I'm not saying you need to start at entry level, but if you were a director in a role and you've completely changed trajectories, you might not end up being a director. Maybe then you're an assistant director. You know, I would say have fluidity, have flexibility, especially when it comes to titles if you're making a big career change. And sometimes even these titles don't always equate to money. Yeah. You know, I've had lesser titles and got paid a lot more money. You know, it doesn't always add up. So you might still be able to obviously take care of, you know, your expenses, you know, but I always recommend people have a flexible mind. You'd rather apply for more jobs than not enough. And that's the other thing I recommend for people. So my biggest tip with applying for jobs is take like 3 or 4 hours on a Saturday, apply to a ton of things that you're genuinely interested in that you would have relevant experience for, but really just knock it all out in one shoot, right? And then be done with it. And then of course, check your emails, check your phone during the week. But what happens is I find some people will do like 2 applications a day and then they get disheartened because now it's Thursday and they haven't heard back from anybody, but they've only really applied for 6 things versus you apply for, I don't know, 25 jobs, you're going to hear back from at least a couple of them, you know, so it's that momentum. Even if ultimately you decide, hey, that wasn't my first pick, you know, it gives you the momentum and the confidence in yourself rather than, I think, if day by day, just doing a little bit, it actually kind of brings that down. My other 2 what I like to say my secrets for interviews and nailing an interview is mention numbers before the interviewer asks you numbers. So that depends on your role. But that might be how you increase sales, how you beat the budget, how you reduce turnover. any way you can mention those numbers, even though they're already in your resume, any way you can mention how you save a company money or increased or made things faster, it goes so far. And then the second thing is, if you can make somebody laugh in an interview, you're pretty much golden.
Okay,
like,
cool.
I mean, I don't know how to, like, and especially like, and I know like it's kind of hard, like, oh my gosh, what am I going to say in the interview to make somebody laugh? I find that self-deprecation, and I don't mean going on and on, but a well-timed joke can actually, I find that it really bridges that. I'll give an example. I had an interview with a VP once, and it was a final interview, I think maybe my fourth, and I was definitely nervous. And I remember she asked me how I handled stress, and I looked at her dead straight and I told her, well, I eat it. I tend to be a bit of an emotional eater. So I was just like, if you see me at 3 p.m. with a cookie, I'm stressed out. And she just busted up laughing, and she'd been so serious the whole way through. And I'm not saying that's what got me the job, but I do know that it created a connection.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and let's be honest, at the end of the day, we all want to work with people we want to be around.
Yeah.
So, the more you can be yourself in an interview and definitely try to smile, but if you can make somebody laugh, the job might as well be yours.
I love that. That's such a nice way to wrap things up. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A panel or into the chat box. We'll be getting through them. In the meantime, I actually do have a question, and it's in relation to what you mentioned about the like the career, I guess, either the career gaps, or if you are entering a career transition, I think how like selecting the right words or the right skill set for that next position could be kind of tricky. Do you have any pointers for, I guess, like repositioning yourself, or even looking at secondary pathways or anything else along those lines?
Yes. The biggest thing I recommend is look up sample resumes for those actual jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So the amount of resume templates that exist out there are amazing. I've helped, friends personally create resumes for jobs I knew nothing about based on Googling what templates look like and then asking them a few questions. So, if you want to look at, okay, so these are the most common information included in those resumes for that next step or for this career transition. These are things I want to incorporate some of those qualities into my resume.
Mm-hmm.
So if, I didn't really, it's hard to say because of career transition, every job is so specific as to what you do. But more so, I'd say if you're switching industries, you can usually leverage similar roles across industries, because at the end of the day, it's hard to say, depending on what you do, but at the end of the day, I to be honest, numbers are numbers.
Mm-hmm.
So any way that you've, again, following back to any way you could show you've helped a company financially, I feel goes far, regardless of what role you're doing, whether that's from, being a marketing director to who knows what. I don't know, a spa. Let's say running a spa. If you can show you can run a business and be a leader, that goes in either role.
Mm-hmm. And it's good to know that, recruiters are at least open to those transferable skills, and they kind of know how to navigate around that and almost position the candidate in a way that best suits them and the position that they could be going for. So it's sort of, like you said, it is a two-way street depending on who you work with. So
and who you work for. Sometimes you have companies like, no, you need 5 years marketing experience, no ifs, ands, or buts, so sometimes some of these hands are tied, but those would be your best inroads.
Yeah. And I've noticed that sometimes it can even change as well. So you can go through the process, and then they might end up like changing their idea of like who they were originally thinking. And I think that must be so frustrating from, more of like the agency side of the recruiter, because you end up, you've packaged this whole thing, you found the perfect person, and then like more towards the end, the company comes back and they're like, oh, actually we decided to take a different direction. And it really doesn't have anything to do with the person or anything else. It's purely maybe the company didn't realize. Yeah.
It really does. I will tell you right now, that's happened to every company I've ever worked for, where and something happens, so like, okay, the best we're pivoting. So I find it's like the most overused word right now.
Yeah, it really is. Mm-hmm.
On this, and it's incredibly excruciating for me, because I personally care so much about what I do, and and making people feel like human beings through the interview process. And no matter how bad an interview goes, my goal is that every person walks out my door or leaves a video chat with me feeling good about themselves, even if like, you know, the position's the right one. So if I've had somebody who's interviewed twice or 3 times, gosh forbid, and then it's like, I'm so sorry, you know, I usually, those are definitely phone conversations where I explain the situation myself personally, because I just feel terrible about it. But, and I know not all recruiters are that way. My goal, and that's part of what Ally Hires is all about, is just really focusing on trying to help HR and recruiters be better at what they do. And I think it starts with creating a personal experience with people.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today to cover all that. So for all of the people who found this helpful or would like to get in touch with you, what are your channels? How can we learn more? Is there anything that we can take away from this?
Absolutely. So Instagram's kind of my jam.
Yes.
You can find me on Instagram, Ally Hires. So just one word. I do have a website. I apologize, I don't update it quite as much. You can also find me on LinkedIn, Ally Barton. It's very much focused on the restaurant industry and hospitality because that is the space I work in, versus my Instagram is very much focused on the hiring, recruiting, best policies and principles when it comes to interviewing and sourcing. I did put together a resource for anybody listening in today who does think they might end up on the market soon. So I put together just a cheat sheet on how to stand out as being remarkable in interviews. So making sure that you're never forgettable again in an interview.
That's exactly what we all need, especially given everything that's going on right now. Any kind of hacks, cheat sheets, especially to get us through this period and give us that cutting edge element. That's amazing. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me. This was such a pleasure.
So with that said, thank you everyone for joining us today. If you do have any questions or if you want to reach out to Ally, you know where to find her. Thank you so much, Ally, for joining us. I really look forward to touching base again soon.
Have a great evening.
Thanks again. Bye.